welcome to those of you who have come. This is a double session in which we're starting to explore international connections for ESIP. And in part one, we just want to explore, so if you could move to the first slide, please. We've got an agenda where in this session, what we want to do is explore known connections or proposed connections with ESIP. And then we all hope you'll come back for the second session, which I think is 4 p.m. for you and 8 a.m. for me, where we will actually move forward and get practical and explore it, exactly what are the ways we can or should ESIP connect, and if so, what are the best ways? So in this session, I'm just going to set the scene. Then Mark will talk about the history of activities overall. Then officially, ESIP is actually a partner in GeoCal? I always forget what it is. And in RDA, ESIP is also officially an organisational member. In recent months, there's been a voice to start having connections between ESIP and Europe. And then I'm just going to outline what's going on in Australia and New Zealand, noting that IMOS, Integrated Marine Observing System in Australia, actually became a partner in 2013. So there's a long history of that. And then just put you on notice that if you're here and you know of any international connections between ESIP partners, ESIP members, and international areas, please speak up and let us know. And then we'll just have some brief discussion. So next slide, please. And so I guess it started to get serious, and from October 17, the ESIP board considered a white paper on what its international role could be. And I thought it was like, 4 options where the board was discussing, well, what are we? Is ESIP primarily a US organisation? Is it an international organisation? Option 3, is it international facilitator? And ESIP is a US organisation with strategic international initiatives. So it was sort of like, an identity crisis. What are we? And then we also actually had sessions in January 2021 and 2023, similar to what we're doing here. So we kind of seem to have them every 2 or 3 years, discussing international connections for ESIP. And next slide, please. I've got this list here and I've put it in the notes. That's what I've been able to drag up on the history. So as you can see, there's the ESIP 2017, the board date update, I think, was 2018. The document past participation was written by the former director, Erin Robinson, and she documented everything. So I guess, the scientist is coming up with the factual basis that we've been able to put together. So next slide, please. So the session goals as part of renewal exploration as to whether wants to be more internationally orientated, and if so, there are 3 questions. Which group should ESIP focus on collaborating with? What types of collaboration should ESIP recognise? And how should ESIP organise and govern international linkages? And as I said, it's in 2 sessions: review of past, current, and a couple of proposed activities from both Australia and Europe. I think you're proposing something, Emmanuel. Okay, so next slide, please. I'll now hand over to Mark, who's going to give us some thoughts, because he's been involved with ESIP from the start, and has some interesting ideas. Over to you, Mark. And please, I'll put it in the chat. I'll put it again. Here are the links to the session notes. Just hit it twice. So just please put your name, affiliation, if you're here. So I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. Yeah, I don't have any slides, but I put my notes. It's sort of a rough script, really, in the collaborative notes, if y'all want to take a look. But basically, ESIP was established about 27 years ago, 27, 28. I'm not exactly sure of the official launch date. And it was a result of a National Academy study advising NASA in particular and its Earth science data centers, the DACs. And basically, the report said collaborate more with other agencies, other industry, academia, et cetera. And NOAA joined fairly soon after that. And then it was a few more years that USGS started pitching in. And so it's always been government funded, but it's always been much more than the US government. And that said, I think it's one of the few places that happen where we have actual interagency collaboration. In Europe, y'all talk a lot about collaborating across countries. We have actually a very similar struggle in getting our agencies to collaborate. And ESIP is one of those few places where I think it's actually really been effective. But like I say, it's includes much more than government, although that's where our funding comes from. So the board started thinking about international collaboration in the mid-teens, I would say. And Leslie put up that document from 2017, which was sort of a white paper that Karen Moe, Peter Fox, and I put together advising the board, laying out those 4 options. And there was sort of a tension of like, obviously earth science is an international endeavor, but we didn't want to lose our focus on our core strengths, and particularly that interagency piece and recognizing where our money came from. And basically, we decided to go slowly and focus more on how to ESIP, as we say, how to collaborate effectively and so forth, rather than extending the formal structure, so rather than so sort of spreading our way of doing work rather than, spreading the organization as such. And it started with Australia and New Zealand, as Leslie indicated. And Leslie's going to say more on how that's been working on their end. We've also had long connections to a few Canadian organizations, but certainly nothing formal and not as tightly connected as you'd think we might be, since we don't have the time zone problem with the Canadians. And we currently only have 2 formal Canadian partners. More recently, we've been making some connections with Europe through EGU in particular. Emmanuel will talk a little bit more about that. And so this started under Susan Shingledecker maybe a year, 2 years ago, and I've been working to forward that a bit. The RDA Community of Practice for Earth, Environmental, and Space Science is an obvious focal point. Obviously that's more than just Europe. RDA is meant to be global, but it's heavily European. In that conversation, some potential areas of collaboration that have emerged is one, the data help desk. That seems to be a big point of connection. I should say, we as in our European partners or people run the data help desk at EGU. Another big focal point, and we had a session on this yesterday, day before, on how the scienceonschema.org works, in particular in collaboration with the cross-domain interoperability framework, as well as some other discovery mechanisms. Steve's been leading that activity. We had a really good session the other day. And other topics that have come up is efficient use of commercial clouds. I've heard a lot, interestingly, from Amazon in particular, but others as well, and the different perspectives they have on how different parts of the world approach use of the commercial cloud. It's a big deal for the U.S. agencies. NASA is moving to the cloud, NOAA is moving to the cloud, and contracting with AWS and others. Europeans, other countries, sort of have a different approach. And AWS has been coming to me saying, we could really use ESIP to figure out how to do this more effectively. Another area that emerged, although I'm not sure it's really going anywhere, is citizen science air quality measurement standards. That was something we might be doing in collaboration with a co-data task group. But I think the key in all is to really have a focal point if we're going to go into a new region. It's not just the individuals, but there's some sort of focal point. With Australia, that was CSIRO, and I think particularly Simon Cox, who was helping push that. Maybe that's a little less clear now. Leslie can comment on that. It's really unclear where it would be in Europe, maybe connected through EGU informatics. But as we saw in the goals statement, I think somewhere for this, there's this desire for collaboration across all these different groups: EPOS, ENVRI, EarthScope, EarthChem, et cetera. And so I think broadly, the RDA community of practice makes a lot of sense. But I think we also really need tighter connections to the relevant agencies in the different countries. I think that's something that we really want to facilitate. So that's kind of an overview of our activity and the strategic thinking of the board. But yesterday's or the day before's session on the tyranny of time zones made me really realize it's really about culture. And as you may have heard, culture eats strategy for breakfast. If it doesn't fit within the ESIP culture, then it's just not going to happen no matter what the board decides. I'm a committed, lifelong internationalist, but we can't take that commitment for granted. International collaboration has a cost, and not just to ESIP staff and infrastructure, but also for the community at large. International collaboration, as I'm sure you all know, can be slow, it can be ponderous. The benefits are not necessarily always readily available to your parent organization that's asking, why are you participating in all this international stuff? And I think also a lot of people coming into ESIP and they're not necessarily thinking about internationalization is not necessarily why they're participating in ESIP in the first place. Now, that said, there have always been some level of international connections in ESIP. It was certainly a big point of discussion when RDA started back in 2013. And also NASA and NOAA, our primary sponsors, have been collaborating with their sister agencies abroad around the world for decades. And that work echoes into ESIP in terms of when we're developing standards and best practices and so forth. And so if we want international organization, it's necessary, it's appropriate for the board and other ESIP leadership to be thinking about how we do this. But of course, what really matters is whether the community can and wants to be international in the way it does things. I would say the staff within their capacity, and I think we can talk about what that capacity is. Basically, the staff will do anything what the community wants. So the question is, what does the community want? And like always, it's a few committed individuals, ideally from multiple countries, who move things forward. They introduce the people, they facilitate the connections, they rearrange the cluster calls to be more internationally friendly. They form these local hubs, formally and informally. They connect us with local sponsors, so on. Leslie is the queen of this. She's connector non-pareil. But there are many more, and like most of you here, I think. And this is the idea, we've been talking about maybe establishing some sort of connectors group to identify and empower those connectors. Douglas maybe will talk more about that in the second session. But like I say, the idea is to amplify and empower those people. And then just finally, coming to an ESIP meeting again, one of the things that always impresses me is how well the community knows how to ESIP. They've got this down. just as an example, if you look at a number of the sessions, they create interesting sessions that define a problem, deliberately work towards solving that problem in a structured way, and then lay out next steps, which people are committed to doing. I think this is becoming more of a normal way for internationally and or collaborative entities to work, but ESIP has been doing it for a long time. ESIP has been working on this for a long time. And the staff actively supports this with guidance, training, facilitation. And I think the community has really learned how to do it well. The community is pretty well adept at this, but there's still that ongoing sort of support. And so I think we definitely want to spread this way of working and broaden our connections. And I think there's a desire and willingness across the community, but we need to be lowering barriers to doing that. That was part of the tyranny of time zones conversation. But we also need to be working on specific problems that people care about, that they want to solve, that they need to solve in an international context. So just in sum, I think that's really the way forward. We need to pick a few focus areas, do it really well, show others how to do it really well, and then build that recognition with broader communities, notably sponsors. So that's sort of my perspective on where we are at the moment. Back to you, Leslie.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Does anyone have any questions of Mark on that comment on the history? Oh, okay, Emmanuel, you're muted.
No, I thought just Mark deserved a little bit of applause for that.
Okay.
Since we're such a small group,
Does anyone else? Next slide, please. So in this segment, we're just going to explore two cases where ESIP is officially part of an international organisation, and the only two I know of, Mark, I don't know if you know of any others, were GEO and RDA. So Carl's going to go first on GEO, and then I will talk about RDA. So over to you, please, Carl.
Great, thank you. And if you could probably advance to the next slide and then the slide after that. So yes, ESIP's engagement with GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, has been long, but is actually very consistent with sort of the historic pattern that Mark was describing, as well as the time span over which ESIP has existed as a community is a little bit longer than GEO, but from nearly the beginning of when GEO was set up, largely on the initiative of our executive directors as sort of doing some of the initial outreach and connection work with GEO, there were individual opportunities for ESIP to gain some exposure and make contributions to the GEO community, whether that was through, Carol Meyer's participation early as a rapporteur for GEO events, or an early presentation that I made in Costa Rica about how, sort of under the combined umbrella of ESIP and OGC, about how OGC standards could, or in my estimation, should play a role in the development of the GEO's system of systems for discovery and accessing Earth observation data, to just continued individual engagements of opportunity more than anything else in GEO activities as they aligned with ESIP interests. In the mid-teens, that dynamic changed a little bit as we continued with sort of the opportunistic engagement, again, largely motivated by our engagement through our executive director. Aaron Robinson was active in our connections with GEO. And it was under her watch that, and very early in her tenure as the executive director, that ESIP became a participating organization within GEO, which was the first time that we had taken on an official role and connection with GEO beyond the individual connections that we had made. And soon thereafter, basically following the creation of an additional arm of GEO governance, the program board, ESIP was the part of the first cohort of GEO organizations, either members or participating organizations, to join and serve on that program board, which provides a key touchstone for GEO in terms of receiving and responding to the broader community needs within GEO. And ESIP has served continuously from 2014 or 2016 on the program board. Our current term was supposed to be renewed or be considered for renewal in 2025, but as GEO is currently going through some governance updates, the continuation of the groups that were going to expire in 2025 has been continued until those GEO updates, governance updates, are modified. So we continue to serve on the program board, though if you look at GEO's documentation, our term ended in 2025. And then we have continued to probably expand our portfolio of ESIP branded contributions to GEO activities in terms of our fairly long-standing work with data, and now known as the Data and Knowledge Working Group and its subgroups. And then more recently, coming out of our participation in the program board, also serving, and this is the work that I'm doing on behalf of ESIP as our current primary program board representative in the GEO Infrastructure Development Task Team, basically the group that is helping GEO envision what the next generation of its infrastructure for Earth observation data will look like, and also the measurement and evaluation task group that is helping GEO develop their strategy for being able to provide consistent, lightweight, and usable measurement tools for the work program that is really kicking off right now for a wide variety of GEO activities. And so this is sort of I would describe as sort of the structured history of our engagement with GEO. But I would go to the next slide and highlight that it's probably as much or more the informal connections and Mark's highlight of the connectors and the role that connectors play within ESIP and between ESIP and other organizations, I think is a critical one. Because while we have, through our administrative engagement with GEO, laid some foundation, we have many more connections through our partners and being the dynamic of individual contributions and participation in ESIP as a part of our broader organizations. A lot of individuals who are active in GEO and in ESIP and are carrying in both directions, from ESIP to GEO and from GEO into ESIP, the insights and lessons learned and products coming out of both organizations into the other. So there is a diffusion aspect. And I just highlighted Kathy Fontaine, who was instrumental in representing ESIP as a part of the program board for many years. She's been having to sort of reduce that as her job requirements have expanded. But, as examples, but certainly not an exhaustive illustration, we have Bob Downs and Bob Chen, who were leaders in the development of the predecessor to the Data and Knowledge Working Group, who were very effective in that bidirectional communication. Suri Jota Khalsa was another key connector between ESIP and GEO and many other organizations. And so we really can't underestimate the value of the connectors in our community for helping to build our international and organizational connections. And Mark already mentioned this, but I'd highlight the specifics of our ESIP funders and how they are key members of the broader U.S. Governmental engagement with GEO through the U.S. GEO. NASA, NOAA, and USGS are key players in the U.S. activities with GEO, and there may be opportunities looking forward in ESIP possibly being able to position itself as it has done in defining and providing a platform for broader community engagement for practitioners in earth science, data, and informatics, where ESIP can possibly help to amplify the investments that are being made by our sponsors who are also providing some degree of sponsorship for GEO. That is currently a dynamic scenario, though, but it's certainly one we need to be thinking about in terms of the overlapping sponsorship. And finally, the next slide, just as an illustration of one case where we have a concrete illustration of this connection, is the work that came out of the Disasters Lifecycle Cluster and the All Hazards Consortium in terms of the operational readiness levels in 2019. And that being highlighted and introduced at the GEO Week in Canberra in November of 2019, and rising to the level of being highlighted as a major outcome as a part of that meeting. So that is an instance where ESIP gained exposure for the work of one of its collaboration areas, and also was able to broaden the impact of the work that's being done within ESIP. But that also was an excellent opportunity for us to have some FaceTime with our Australian colleagues, as we were able to take advantage of our co-location, at least within the continent, and meet with folks who were part of our local collaborators in the Canberra area. So this is also something to be thought about in terms of how participation in organizations can help introduce those opportunities for face-to-face connections, in addition to the requisite and habitual virtual connections. And with that, I think I am done with my sort of overview of where we have come in our engagement with GEO.
Okay, thanks very much, Carl. You hit a memory cell on the 2019, because I remember you all coming out to Canberra, and in fact we ended up having a meeting at the Academy of Science, in which Australian Academy of Science, in which Erin and everyone sat down, because the Academy of Science were kind of interested in these connections, particularly in the earth sciences. I mean, sort of to be asked for a meeting at the Australian Academy of Science was quite a hit. So does anyone have any questions from Carl on GEO? Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so Carl, as you know, GEO is an intergovernmental organization as opposed to an international organization. It's a collaboration of governments, not just individuals. And as such, it tends to be kind of ponderous, as intergovernmental organizations are. And I'm just wondering if you could give sort of a frank assessment, your opinion on the health of GEO. I mean, in my opinion, it had a hard time getting rolling. And then when Barbara Ryan took over as executive director, I think it became much more pragmatic and functional. With the U.S. sort of pulling away from international collaboration and so forth. Yes, just what's your sort of frank assessment of the health of GEO?
I think it is relatively healthy, but one of the key challenges that it faces and is trying to be more conscientious in addressing is transitioning from an international to a global organization, because the active participation, especially outside of the ministerial engagements that happen every other year as a part of the plenary meetings of GEO, where the national representatives attend and do ministerial things. The engagement of the broader global community, especially the global South, is an area that is where GEO is trying to make improvements, but it's still a work in progress. The funding and support issue, it remains fluid from what I've been seeing and hearing in terms of changing budget requests in the U.S. in particular. The U.S. has been a major sponsor from the very beginning of GEO. That was certainly brought into question and highlighted as an area of uncertainty at the plenary meeting in Rome last spring. And despite changing U.S. Legislative budget changes that have literally just been happening over the past weeks, it remains unclear what the funding and support is for GEO, especially as the emphasis for funding is becoming more targeted and strategic as opposed to organizational and community. So I think that remains an area of vulnerability for GEO, as the U.S. is a major sponsor. One of the challenges is that GEO, I think, has largely been, and this is certainly the case for the Secretariat, remains somewhat Euro-dominated. The participation in at least the sample of groups that I work with in GEO has the center of gravity is still somewhat Eurocentric, but again, they're trying to explicitly expand participation from the rest of the global community, but that remains an ongoing activity. So it remains a work in progress, especially in this transition from international to global.
Right, right. And so remind me again, what agency is the formal U.S. rep? Is it NOAA?
I believe, yes. Yeah, I think NOAA is the current formal rep, though. As an example, for the plenary in Rome, NASA and NOAA were both there as parts of the U.S. Delegation for representing the U.S. Ministerial membership.
Okay. Yeah, and there's always been strong NASA connection. Like all the actors that you highlighted, they had NASA relationships. I mean, when
right.
Kat was most active with it was when she was with NASA.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions of Carl? Okay, so I'll start now with the Research Data Alliance, and Mark, I'll probably call on you to help with this because I don't know the full story, but next slide, please. Okay, so ESIP is an organisational member of RDA. I've got 2014. Mark actually thinks it was 2018. So there is a formal connection between ESIP and RDA at the high level. Next. Okay. So now I just want to talk about this Space Environmental Science Interest Group, which had as chairs Kelly, Danny, myself, Pedro from Brazil, Helen, and Erin Robinson, when she was ED of ESIP, was one of the chairs of this group. Next. And it has an interesting history because it was kind of driven by Mohan and Kirsten Leonard, who were with EarthCube at the time. And we had a plenary meeting, a session at 2017. And what actually happened there was ESIP was there, as in Erin, ENVI, EPOS, EDI, EarthCube, all those organisations who were listed. And we thought it wasn't so much EarthCube going international, but all these research infrastructures dealing with data, etc., joining in and making an international group that focused more on research data. And I would argue that although there were some government organisations in it, they were mostly research. And again, it was the connector theme about can we connect and expose what they're all doing. And we actually have 2 historical outputs that are still ticking away, and we add to them every meeting. So the first one is just all the research infrastructures and government agencies, and it's got a list of projects, and I need to go through and filter it out because it's going through so long that some of them are dead in the water now. The second catalogue is about people who are working on vocabularies, ontologies, informatics resources that are foundational to what we do in information. And so it was essentially an interest group that raises awareness of who is doing what, where. Next slide, please. And we were aiming to coordinate and harmonise efforts in the Earth and Space informatics area to reduce possible duplication, increase efficiency, share use cases, and promote international partnerships and adoption. And we developed this formula of meetings whereby we always had what we called the lightning presentations, where we invited people to just give a quick 5-minute summary of what they were doing, and then we went into deeper dives for the rest of the meeting. And the connection to ESIP, and notice that in the title it was ESIP RDA, was that members could showcase their work, and so ESIP Information Quality Cluster came along. Danny's work in this group started out partly in the ESIP cluster. There was also a little bit of the CDF, CDF data facility, and it actually became an RDA working group, and it's going gangbusters at the moment, and that's exploring improving the workflow from when a researcher submits a manuscript with data to publication and the connections between the repository, the publications, and the researcher. The AGU work on complex citation, I know in the early days, Shelley brought that several times to meetings. It also has now come up to be an RDA working group, and I don't know how many times I nagged the Science on Schema.org group, and I can't remember the other one, was constantly saying to them, please come and present. And so what it enabled people to do was to come to explore in an international situation what they were doing in their local ESIP clusters. I also used to grab people who, when some guidelines were endorsed by ESIP, to come and just raise international awareness. And as I said, I must get back to doing it because I've got a bit slack in doing this lately, but we put a call out for ESIP clusters to promote their work as either a lightning presentation, and some of it was like with Danny's work, we actually gave a whole session to what she was doing, which is why I think it then led up into that working group. And so again, I've got the connection. If you sign up, you've got a place to internationally advertise from ESIP what you're doing. Next. Yeah, again, Mark's put the complex citation, so it's a two-way process. Okay, so we kind of started to get bigger and bigger, and we then morphed into a community of practice. And if you notice, we now have chairs in addition from the UK. Emmanuel's one of the chairs, Japan, Costa Rica, but we're still going on with this same formula, and I'd welcome any ESIP clusters. If you want a 5-minute spot on the program, we can easily give it to you for our plenary, which I think is March. It's a virtual one that's coming up. Next. Okay, so that's sort of, like I say, it's the organisational membership at the top level, and then this cluster. I should have pointed out that when we went to a community of practice, we dropped the ESIP name. Not quite sure why that happened, but it did. This is really a summary. As I said, we've had sessions at ESIP in 2021 and 2023, and I just wanted to raise this from the January session. And it's exactly as Carl, his diagram was fantastic about this diffusion of ESIP into GEO. The same thing is happening in RDA. And many members participate in interest group, working groups, and in the plenaries in BOFs of various sorts. The conclusion was that we didn't seem to know who was participating in what, and whether they are presenting ESIP perspectives or whether they are there in their capacity as part of other organisations. And Mark's, at that last meeting, rattled off a lot more connections than I knew about. But I just raised as the final dot point that some participants asked if this was a missed opportunity to measure the impact and influence of ESIP. I'll just put that on the table. And I think that's my last slide, is it? Yep, okay. So before we go on now to talking about specifics in countries with Europe and Australia, I'll just ask if can anyone add anything to what I said about ESIP and RDA, because I know I don't have the full story. And do you want to add anything to it? Mark?
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I think your last bullet was really telling. In the early days of RDA, I know ESIP was sort of grappling with how do we participate, what's our role, et cetera. And I know a number of clusters, certainly the stewardship committee, sort of designated sort of specific liaisons. It's like, these are areas that RDA is working on, that we're working on, and we want to make sure that we're connected. And it was, it wasn't formal, but it was, sort of recognized in a way. That seems to have faded. And so I think at a very easy level, that would be one way to sort of, just be more conscious of where those connections are occurring. Because like you say, it's the people, there are people that play in multiple places. But how is that, how is that diffusion that Carl was talking about actually happening? Is there a way that we can measure that? I think that's something that maybe we can talk about more in the discussion session and maybe tomorrow. But because it is happening, but it's just not visible, and so it's not clear that ESIP as an organization, as opposed to a group of individuals, which is largely what ESIP um, is really engaged. So I guess I'm just sort of amplifying your last point.
Thanks, Mark. Emmanuel?
Yeah, I just wanted to hear your idea of because it puzzles me sometimes a little bit, and that's kind of comments sometimes you get or I get is where do you see that I can just maybe 2 or 3 key terms, where do you see the difference between the ESIP working groups and the RDA working groups? I mean, they seem to be kind of focusing for a similar goal, but what is the who would you advise to go to one or the other? Or is there an advice to that? Or what? Yeah. Sometimes I'm a little bit puzzled about that, and so I like to hear arguments for people who go to RDA say, yeah, please also go to ESIP because dot dot dot.
Yeah, I just find that, or the initial intention with Erin on the interest group was that it was an opportunity for ESIP clusters to firstly showcase what they're doing to an international audience, and RDA was the way of achieving that. But also, again, I'm interested in, I'm loving picking up in this whole ESIP meeting the differentiation between global and international.
Mm.
And if you say the aim is global, okay, and you want to set up global networks of information sharing, say, to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, then you really have to explore what your recommendations are, like for data citation guidelines, which were really great, and get the opinions of others. And I think as we go forward in this day, one thing I learned, I was just blown away by the quality and advancement of the work going on in Africa and in Asia. And if we're talking about global data sharing, then where is the place where we can do this? And I feel that ESIP's doing outstanding work, but it's, getting that exposed. And I don't think it's so much internationalisation, because my experience has been that if someone does a really darn good job, which is what I was thinking about with that meeting on CDIF and SOSA yesterday, that, like here you had the experts all getting together. I think the other issue with RDA, and people have alluded to, is that it is fairly European-centric or very much global north, okay? Because global north to me includes Australia and New Zealand, which is a bit of an anomaly. The co-data working groups, on the other hand, really get the global south. But I still feel that getting it at least into RDA is a start to just do a check, a balance, open up what you're doing to see whether it can be improved by exposing it to a broader audience and having their opinions from RDA community, or whether you should, which either means you expand or actually you find if you've got something that's really good, it just gets adopted very quickly. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's more exposure.
It helps.
Okay, so Mark, do you want to follow on with what I'm saying, or Carl? Who do we go to first?
Well, if I can jump in, sorry, Carl, because I have a couple comments on Emmanuel's questions. The difference between the working groups at a fundamental level is, of course, ESIP is focused on earth science, earth and environmental science. RDA is in theory, all disciplines. So that's one key difference. Another key difference is, frankly, it's a lot easier to start a cluster in ESIP than it is to start a working group in RDA. There's a lot less process. It's much more fluid. Thirdly, to ESIP's fault, or just the nature of getting to this culture thing I was talking about earlier, we tend to be more U.S. focused and driven by U.S. agency needs in ESIP. I mean, just to give you one example, where there's a concurrent session going on right now that is very NASA centric. It's about ESDIS. It's got 4 times the participation as this one, and so that's the culture from where ESIP comes from, and so being more deliberate about the international connections, I think, is going to take some sort of work. So it's easier to get going in ESIP, but you're going to have a more limited scope, I think, is basically the short answer.
Carl?
And I would extend that, because as a complement to the core role that culture plays, geography does play a role as well. As we were talking about in terms of time zones on Tuesday, we do tend to focus or prioritize the things that we are paying attention to based on proximity to us and our work. And so we do tend to gravitate towards exchanges that are going to be more proximate to us geographically and in addition to topically. So it's natural that we do see these sort of geographic areas of focus, like we see in ESIP, based on the origins of ESIP as a set of NASA-funded projects, and then largely U.S. Funding agency projects that were encouraged to participate as the seeds for our community. And that's one of the reasons why one model that was informally discussed in the early conversations within the ESIP leadership around internationalization is the idea of a network of networks, sort of acknowledging that we are fairly comfortable working within our local networks that are more closely oriented to our more local interests and needs. But thinking about how we can facilitate exchange and communication and maximize the impact happening within our local or regional networks more broadly. And this idea of what or how we can, bring in this idea of extending the network effect that we enjoy very heavily in ESIP, and that GEO, with its somewhat stronger center of gravity in Europe, enjoys in terms of being able to be well aligned with the European partners in particular, and then trying to break out of that shell. Thinking about how we can, explicitly recognize that a network of networks model for engagement may be something worth at least considering.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's okay. I think that's a good explanation.
Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, we'll now pass on to you, Emmanuel, to talk about Europe and ESIP.
Yep. Okay, move on to the next slide. Yes, so I just stole this. So basically, these are some ideas that I discussed with Susan at the EGU help desk, for example, and just ventilating with the people there. So I'll just quickly summarize of what I heard from the discussions I had about ESIP or about the ESIP products with my colleagues and with the folks that I met around at the help desk and at the different meetings. So just a quick look on I stole that from Leslie's slide. There's only 2 European partners in ESIP at the moment, and that's the Helmholtz Metadata Collaboration, which is where I come from, and the UK Met Office's Information Lab. And I could say I was dragged in here by Pierluigi Buttigieg a couple of years ago, who told me, this is a great community, you should join. Basically he dragged us along, and there I am. And I never regretted it. It was really a great experience. It is still a great experience. So in the interest of ESIP, to take a look at what could be, how could Europe participate there? I think we should ask ourselves, what do we want to achieve, and what do we need to consider for that participation? So let's take a look at the next slide. Okay. So just reiterate ESIP's vision there: a world where data-driven solutions are a reality by making Earth science data actionable by all who need them anywhere and anywhere. So there's a global approach, and the mission is to empower innovative use and stewardship of Earth science data to solve our planet's greatest challenges. So, I mean, even though it is from the outside seen as a US initiative, it clearly has a global approach, and in theory and also in practice, invites everyone, not only US-centric, and that is completely in line with how Europe, or how we understand data solutions, that we need to like global exchange, and that we want to avoid to produce community information silos, like silos where ideas are ventilated within a closed community. What we want is to exchange the ideas on a global scale, and to make sure that we're not reinventing wheels, that we're not producing systems that are not compatible or not interoperable with each other, following the FAIR principles as we all try. So the next slide, please. Okay, so what are I asked myself, what would be the benefits of expanding ESIP to Europe? And that obviously would be, that we get better information about how we work in our organizations, what are our priorities, and how do we develop our data systems? Because I think it's largely unknown to most of us what happens inside of our organizations. That's pretty opaque. We want to develop a bit better awareness for current trends and developments, because that's also what we're taking a look at. What are others implementing? To take a look at, is that something I can do myself in my organization? Also, because these things get much more attractive for the organizations once they know that others are already doing that. So forming kind of a center of gravity for technical and infrastructural developments. We also want to, of course, harmonize our data practices and procedures across borders. This is already difficult within Europe, so it's even more demanding across continents. And also seen from Europe, I know many of you don't feel the same, but many of the US data structures to us seem to be much better organized than ourselves. Maybe it's a view on our little bit chaotic continent here with so many countries, but many things just seems to be so much straightforward. And so many Europeans, they tend to look at the US as the leading partner there. And so they take a look at what are they implementing, and then ask themselves, should we do the same thing? And thus, there is a responsibility for ESIP and for the US, I think, also to reduce the risk of implementing incompatible practices and just together harmonize these things. And we traditionally see the US in the lead there. We still try to do our share, of course, but that's a little bit still the perception. So let's take a look at the next slide. Hi, Shelley. Yes. Okay. So is ESIP well known in Europe? Actually, no. Many people know that it exists, but they never considered joining ESIP or even attending the meetings, because there is the feeling that it's a US only initiative. and overall, Europe is big enough to keep it, to keep occupied with our own problems, like the US. We're basically revolving around ourselves. But on the other hand, some of the products like the science.schema.org AI readiness checklist, they are quite well known and they are used across European initiatives. So so there is interest in those groups. As far as I observe, not so much in working with the groups, but in using the results of the groups and to take a look at what are the services that are there and how can we use what is developed there. Nevertheless, many European activities or initiatives do not do their homework well enough to actually look at stuff that is developed elsewhere and thus tend to reinvent the wheel, unfortunately. Okay, next one. So I just grabbed this together. This is not complete. This is just a very brief look on what our data landscape looks like. And so we have, as you know, the European Open Science Cloud initiatives. There's a large program. There's lots of temporary funding for very interesting projects. There's the national initiative. There's the national initiatives that are kind of working with and towards into the EOSC. Also, all of them temporary funding. There are complementary data initiatives within the country. So this is just an example from Germany, and this is really only a very few projects. There's dozens, if not 100, different projects that are funded by the federal government, by the states, by the universities, and so on. So there's really a lot of people occupied with it. And then there's these large national research organizations like Helmholtz, which I work for, like the BGS, like INRIA from in France, the NERC also in the UK, CNRS and so on, which are like, I would say similar to NOAA or NASA in scope. And run also their own and most of the very large data systems. So this is a very kind of a chaotic, it's partly chaotic landscape which spawns a lot of initiatives, workshops, stuff that keeps people, and this keeps people occupied completely, right? Okay, next slide. Yes. So if you look at this, these projects, they fall into two categories. So there's the folks that have temporary funding, and they do not have very much long-term thinking. They develop quick solutions. They need to show their results quickly. But then, on the other hand, they're gone after 3 to 6 years. And they may have a great product, but most of them never make it into a real service. And it's very hard to deal with them because they create a lot of noise. A lot of very interesting ideas, but also everything very short-term lived. And then there's the long-term funding, which mainly comes from these large federal institutions, governmental institutions, agencies, and it's more like long-term thinking and like strategic work, which is and I think under the radar, these institutions do actually drive these large initiatives like EOSC and in Germany, NFDI. That's basically the backbone of these. And while they're not trying to be too dominant on them, they're basically putting the basis of everything. So next one. So my suggestion, my idea for ESIP is I understood. So the first title I had was ESIP Euro ? So I would say ESIP Euro ? No, we don't need a separate ESIP in Europe. Of course not. But what we should, I think it would be very important to connect ESIP to the large research organizations. So which means connecting connecting the large organizations that actually have a connection to the local and European-wide initiatives. I think that would make very much sense, and it would provide a much better long-term perspective on cooperation, which I think would be very much appreciated by these institutions. In order to harmonize, how we deal with data, maybe aggregate data together, stuff like that, making these things available for new kinds of research. So how can we do that? So the RDA plenaries, of course, are that's where people go. RDA, IDW, Digital Curation Center. Workshops, EGU. I mean, the data help desk is very interesting, very important, and it just not always reaches the right people because there's mostly scientists there. It's not necessarily the data people there. Regional conferences, organizing exchange across our large-scale infrastructures. So my suggestion would be for ESIP to partner with these to address these large-scale research organizations and partner with them on this kind of strategic level for the moment, and then from there spawn the outreach into the communities. So the added value of ESIP over the RDA, I just asked that question, and you're absolutely right. I also have the feeling that ESIP is more like a community of practice, or more like a hands-on initiative than RDA, which is more conceptual, which makes it much more practical and much more useful for the organizations. So I think that's it for me. I think there's one more slide, maybe. Yeah. So as a personal note, I always, and I think that's the same for most of you. I always recognize, and that's what I really like with ESIP, that it has such a kind of very familiar character. It's like a big family. People talk to each other. It's really very cozy. And to my experience, that usually is the case if the organization is not bigger than, let's say, 200, 250 people. So if you get too big, you basically start losing this familiarity focus. So I think it's really, if ESIP grows, it is worth to think about how these structures would change and whether they need to be more formal, and it may need to reconsider the ESIP's vision and mission if that happens. So that's up to you to discuss that. Gemütlich, exactly. Well, whatever the English term for that is, I don't know. That's it for me. That was my take on Europe. And I thank you for listening.
Okay, so just looking in time, we've still got to cover Australia. Are there any questions of Emmanuel on ESIP Europe?
Dozens.
We can discuss it in the next session,
Yeah, we can discuss it in the next session.
Carry it over to the next session, or?
Yeah. So, but just your characterization of Europe as having this chaotic landscape. And you sort of address this. Maybe RDA is that sort of focal point, but is there a focal point? I mean,
I would say I don't. So the chaos also stems because it's not only Earth and environment, of course. I mean, that's the whole community. All disciplines. In terms of Earth and environment, yes, RDA is one of the focal points. The NFDI for Earth, that's the consortium within the NFDI within Germany, is one of the focal points. But honestly, and yes, this is recorded, but nevertheless, I am very reluctant to really work with them because they're so slow. no, so they're we have this adoption curve, this bell curve where you're early adopters and you have the second stage, pickups, and then that goes down again. And I feel we're always pushing the edge there, like just trying to adopt early, take a look at what can we push, and try to motivate people to adopt stuff that we think is ready but not yet in place, right? And they are somewhere in the later stage, so we have to combine these somehow, and that's a pain, because you have the same discussions again that you had before you were adopting stuff. And yeah, that's sometimes that's my criticism with the NFDI is that they're not doing their homework and looking what is there and then actually just adopted that.
Right. So many other comments. I'll save them for tomorrow, but just one quick one, or for the next session. One quick one with your point about short-term funding, that it happens and then it goes away. A value proposition that ESIP started pitching, or has been pitching for a while, but I think it's finally getting some resonance, is that if you have a funded project and you come to ESIP with your project, it will have much bigger adoption, much greater buy-in, and SOSO is the prime example of that. That was initially just a short-term NSF-funded project, now has global impact. So I think that's just a pitch that we can make.
Right. I think one of the reasons is that most of the data landscape is research driven, and so they're acting as research projects. They're not acting as infrastructure projects, and that makes it very difficult. That's a German thing. The NFDI was set up and decided by researchers, and we were always trying to fight against that and say, well, we need infrastructure, and we need services, and we need structures. They didn't listen, So now there's a big discussion on how we can change that and how that's gonna end. I don't know. It will move somewhere, I'm sure, and it will work out. It will just take a little bit longer.
Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on, and I'll just try and seed some ideas from Australia. So next slides. Thanks very much, Emmanuel. Okay, so I just went through the list, and I've entitled this as known, okay? Because I really would need to definitively check with ESIP. But this is where I've listed where we have what I'm going to say national, either government or research organisations. And you can see that there are 7 from Australia and 1 from New Zealand. Next slide, please. I also got a little bit confused, not confused, but I thought it was worth pointing out that ESIP also has these international partners. And for example, in Australia, we are very active in Earth Systems Grid, CoData, World Data Systems. So I was just sort of trying to highlight those national organisations, because that's sort of like with ESIP starting out with NASA, NOAA, USGS, and its other partners. Next. So this is just a bit of the history. We started getting going in 2015, 2016. Simon Cox, who was a great friend of Peter Fox, was invited to quite a few meetings, and Simon said, hey, to me and Jens Klump and a few of us, hey guys, have a look at what this mob's doing in ESIP. Sorry, mob's an Australian term. And we said, wow, this really is worth looking at, and you were very well organised, and some of your clusters were like, you were actually formulating and doing things that we still had on the drawing board. And so we formed Earth Environmental Science Partners, it's similar to ESIP, but we had a mix of research and government agencies. We even had joint ESIP meetings where ESIP people came out to Australia. Our peak was January when we had 10 in-person attendees at the ESIP January meeting. And Emmanuel, I'll give you a bit of history. We were E2SIP, and around that time we were thinking of doing E3SIP, Earth and Environmental Science Partners Europe. And that was more coming from the research infrastructures like EPOS and ENVRI, and there were people from those organisations at that meeting. Now, I don't know whether you remember what the significance of January 2020 was. Next slide, please. COVID hit. And although we were getting the interest and we continued, and as we all switched to virtual participation as it dragged on, started to drop off very quickly. And as a part of it going on for so long, Australian travel budgets dropped significantly, and they still have not reached pre-COVID levels. And the interest, which again Mark alluded to, in being part of international standard sharings, government agencies participating in these networks, has really dropped off. And so the government agencies that had the long-term funding that were driving a lot of this collaboration, and I'm not just speaking for Australia, I'm actually arguing for a lot of the geological surveys and those organisations, they're just nowhere near as active in these global standards initiatives to what they were pre-COVID. Now, I'm not blaming COVID as being the thing that stopped it, but it's something that is a fact. Next. And again, as I pointed out in the time zone problem, when you share a time zone with Eastern Siberia and it's the most popular time, you don't win. And so I think we're going to greater virtualisation, but that was why I organised that tyranny of time zones. And I think it was a real shock to a few people at that meeting to realise what an impact this does have. And although Australia and US and Europe can meet reasonably easily, it is hard to get those darn Aussies to be able to be easily part of what you're doing. Next. And post-COVID, Simon's retired. I have bandwidth, but it's limited. And we really struggled to get interest in ESIP and in E2SIP. But next slide. In parallel, while I was struggling to get ESIP going as part of another initiative that formed in Australia, the Earth and Environmental Science Research Infrastructures and several government agencies combined to form this group called ESIP, and you've got Logo Lotto down there. And they were talking about how the infrastructures that, like the surveys, the instruments, that's what they're there for. But as part of the commitment to those, these infrastructures have to be responsible and accountable for the data that they produce, and it is fair. And what happened was all these data issues kept on coming up to these people that were really infrastructure gurus. So they formed this information standards panel called ESIP, and we meet regularly, and 7 of these are partners. And through regular meetings, we're doing exactly kind of what you would do in ESIP. And anyway, at one of our meetings recently, I said, look, what are we going to do about E2SIP? 7 of you are partners. And 2 people spoke up and said, Leslie, look at the room, look at the audience you've got. This is still ESIP, only it's reincarnated in a different format. And so, again, as a result of that, we started this As some of you know, we did a hub and spoke meeting personally in Canberra. And right now we're running another one where, like, when I finish with this, the 8 o'clock session, we have another 3 sessions where there's about 8 of us, and we're listening to your recordings and sharing the meetings. So just saying, we're just trying to get there. Next. And again, exactly as the slide Emmanuel showed, that within these groups we're connected on the left. Sorry, I'll make this clearer. On the left-hand side, you've got the connection to the infrastructures in these groups. We're connected to ESIP, RDA, etc. And within the partners, we're finding we've got these incredible connections to World Fair, CMIP, GBIF. And so it's the connections. Now, one of the amazing things is that we meet regularly at EGU for the last year or so, and all your organisations are invited to come, and we get enthusiastic. The energy in the room is great, and we're going to do something. And a lot of the plans we want to work on are data, but nothing ever happens. And so I was talking to Tim Rawling, who's in charge of Oscope, and picking up again on what Emmanuel said, we see these clusters in ESIP doing the fantastic things that we want to do. So instead of these groups setting up yet another set of data things to try and get these things forward, can we get these data collaborations going through the ESIP clusters, not formal, but and progress that. So next slide. A really recent development is that Oscope, EPOS, Earthscope have actually in December 24 signed an MOU, and just last week New Zealand has joined in. And so again, it's they're already starting to work on data resilience, which has come through in part me making them aware of what was going on in the sustainability data management cluster of ESIP. And what could we achieve? And I've got, if ESIP 2 eventuates, Emmanuel, I totally agree with you. We don't need to necessarily form an E2, E3 SIP as we used to call it, but more, what is a better way that we can participate and leverage in the fantastic work that some of the ESIP clusters are doing? Okay, so I think that's my last slide. Well, again, if there's any other international experiences, I think we'll have to post move them over to the next session, which I think, Steve, we've got bandwidth for, particularly if more people come. So are there any questions on issues I just raised? Oh, so just in answer to what Mark's said, it's actually that ESIP group that is coordinating the 2 experimental hubs. So just as background, the July hub we had an in-person, but January in Australia is absolutely hopeless because everyone's on holidays and at the beach. So we actually are just doing that via setting up Zoom meetings where we're sharing and recordings of a few chosen sessions from ESIP. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Yeah. I just have one question, because you showed the world map, and I was looking at the time zones, and as I had been working in Japan for a couple of years. That's 20 years ago now, but and we had organized like the IODP at that time, so International Drilling Programs, and we had exactly the same problem that we had split office hours with our European, because we had European partners and US American partners, so we had split office hours. We were talking in the mornings, we were talking to one of them, but in the evenings we were talking to the others. for Australia to partner with Japan and Korea, for example, wouldn't that be a way to create a bigger center of gravity or a bigger center of interest there? I'm not sure. I have no idea how active they are and how well it would work to work with them.
I think the potential is there, and certainly, Mark, you raised it when we ran that hub in Australia. You said it was so easy to include those, but I guess at the moment we have a driver in that these MOUs have been signed between US, Australia, and Europe. I think I'd like to try and get that going, because we really do need to bring, like SOSA. AI readiness was the other cluster I've been trying to get to come and present at the RDA Earth Science Community of Practice. Sort of, I guess what I'm saying, walk before you can run. But yes, that's the vision that you could do later. And so that comes back to the 4 dot points I put at the start with Mark. Is ESIP a catalyst for these international collaborations in earth and environmental science? I think that's the other thing, as Mark alluded to, it's earth and environmental science.
Right.